Antigonos the One Eyed, killed in action in 301 BCE. Koei has a long-running strategy series about the Sengoku era of Japanese history. This series is called Nobunaga's Ambition in recognition of Oda Nobunaga's efforts to unite all of Japan under his rule. If Koei were to make a similar series about the Successor era, then Antigonos' Ambition would be as fitting a title as any. Plutarch called Antigonos the One Eyed the oldest and greatest of the successors. Antigonos came tantalizingly close to unifying all of Alexander's empire, and his descendants were eventually able to establish a dynasty in Macedon that lasted for about a century. Antigonos' rise to such heights was not easy to predict, however. For someone so famous, Antigonos the One Eyed had rather obscure origins. We know next to nothing about Antigonos' early life. We know that Antigonos' father was named Philip, and that he had two brothers named Ptolemaeus and Demetrius. Since the command of armies and provinces only went to members of the high nobility, especially in the early going of Alexander's campaign, the fact that Antigonos was one of the first satraps that the young conqueror appointed indicates that Antigonos' family was one of the most powerful houses in Macedon. Years later, when Antigonos decided to back Cassander in a civil war, he claimed that he was doing so due to his old friendship with Antipater, and given that the two men had both been in service for many years, it is possible that they had developed a genuine friendship at some point. Antigonos served under Philip II with some distinction. During one of Philip's sieges, probably at either Byzantium or Perdiccas, Antigonos was shot in the eye with an arrow. Rather than fall back for treatment, Antigonos refused to cease fighting until the battle was won. This wound necessitated the removal of his eye, and gave Antigonos his nickname, the One Eyed. As a tall man with a heavy build who was probably over 6 feet tall, at an age when 5'6" or so was average to tall for an adult male, and now having an eye patch and abundant charisma, Antigonos had a great deal of presence and was an unmistakable figure. For his friends and defenders, Antigonos' missing eye was a sign of his valor and service. His enemies, perhaps predictably, called him a Cyclops. In many of our anecdotes about Antigonos, he is either making bawdy jokes or quoting the Athenian playwright Euripides. In the ancient sources, Antigonos is characterized as being harsh, arrogant, prideful, and power-hungry. Despite this characterization, there are a number of times when we hear about Antigonos being good personal friends with this or that successor, so surely his arrogance and harshness is quite exaggerated. He also appears to have had extraordinary mental and physical energy, and to have had an unbreakable will. Unlike his son Demetrius, who had an insatiable libido, Antigonos does not seem to have strayed from his wife. Not partaking in the polygamous norms of the dynast of his time, nor having any known mistresses, Antigonos was almost uniquely chaste. However, Antigonos did love to eat and drink, and his increasing weight would weaken his effectiveness in his later years. While later sources have Philip II saying that Parmenion was his only competent general, we know that he entrusted other men with weighty duties. So far as I can tell, Antipater was his second most trusted general, and Antigonos was the third. As someone who himself was an affable, one-eyed man who enjoyed a good night of drinking, one wonders if Philip II thought of Antigonos as something like a larger-scale version of himself. In 336, Philip II was assassinated and Alexander ascended to the throne. It is not clear whether Antigonos was a part of the Macedonian vanguard operating under Parmenion in Asia Minor, or whether he was with Alexander while he was dealing with his enemies in Greece and on the Danube. In 335-34, Antigonos married Stratonice, the only wife that he ever had and the mother of his son Demetrius. Stratonice had previously been married to his brother Demetrius, and it is possible that this Demetrius was the biological father of Antigonos' son and heir, since the marriage to Stratonice and the birth of Demetrius corresponded rather closely. By the time that Antigonos married Stratonice, he was already 47 years old, and there is no indication that he was previously married. In 334, the Greek city of Priene published a decree in the late summer thanking Antigonos for liberating the city from Persian control and installing a democracy. Unlike in mainland Greece, the Macedonian policy in Asia under Alexander tended to favor the democratic factions in the Greek polis, since Persia tended to favor tyrants and oligarchies. In the spring of 333 BCE, Alexander appointed Antigonus to be the new satrap of Phrygia, an area which was vital for maintaining overland communications between Alexander's expedition and Macedon itself. This would be part of the corridor for moving reinforcements to Alexander, and it was therefore crucial. Since the area had not been fully subdued, Alexander left Antigonus with 1,500 mercenaries to bring the area fully under Macedonian control. At this time, the Persians still had a fleet and mercenary army under Memnon of Rhodes, so Antigonus could reasonably expect trouble, even though Phrygia did not border the sea. In November 333, Alexander defeated Darius III at Issus. While this opened up the coast of the Levant to Alexander's army, it also left a lot of routed Persians in Asia Minor. These men were reorganized and sent against Alexander's supply lines, while Alexander was engaged in a 7-month ordeal of a siege at Tyre. The man responsible for dealing with them was Antigonos the One Eyed. When these Persian troops arrived in Phrygia, after having called up more men in Paphlagonia and Cappadocia, Antigonus's army was in a depleted state after he had forwarded many of his men to Alexander's main force. Despite being greatly outnumbered, Antigonus was able to fight and win 3 separate battles against these Persians, probably with considerable help from neighboring satraps like Cassander in Lydia. After neutralizing this threat, Antigonus built an ad hoc army around his bodyguard troops, some Greek mercenaries, and local levies, and then managed to invade and conquer Lycaonia. This achievement may have earned him fame in antiquity, but our sources for this period are so heavily focused on Alexander's deeds that they tended to ignore his generals and governors, many of whom, like Antigonus and his colleagues in Asia Minor, Balacrus and Callus, made considerable gains for the empire. In addition to his military achievements, Antigonus seems to have been a far better governor than almost all of his peers throughout Alexander's realm. When Alexander returned from the east and discovered that many of his governors were corrupt, he oversaw a mass firing in 324 that even included executing a number of wayward satraps. Of all of the satraps throughout the empire, only Cleomenes in Egypt and Antigonus in Phrygia were retained in their office after the Great Administrative Purge. In the summer of 323, Alexander died at Babylon. Prior to the great king's death, there is no indication that he had any great plans for Antigonus. Antigonus does not seem to have had a role in either Alexander's coming invasion of Arabia, nor in the early versions of his plan to attack westward. Alexander's death may have raised Antigonus's hopes for greater things, as he was one of the most experienced men in the empire at the time, although he was technically lower ranking than the bodyguards. When Perdiccas confirmed his assignment in Phrygia and then ordered him to aid Eumenes' efforts in conquering Cappadocia, Antigonus seems to have been offended. While it is possible that his noncompliance was due to some material factor, most likely Antigonus was not a supporter of Perdiccas, and he was not looking to serve as a subordinate under Alexander's Greek secretary. When Perdiccas arrived in Asia Minor, his visit was largely due to the failure of Leonidas and Antigonus to comply with his orders. Since Antigonus was the nearest general, the regent berated him, and Antigonus found himself in danger of losing both his office and his life. When Cunane was killed in the scuffle with Perdiccas' troops and Cleopatra arrived in Sardis, Antigonus deciphered Perdiccas' ambitions. Visiting Antipater and Craterus in Europe, who were preparing to smite the Aetolians, Antigonus persuaded them that Perdiccas was the biggest threat and that they needed to act swiftly. The decision to ignore the Aetolians would allow them to evolve into a counterbalance to Macedonian power for years to come, much to the chagrin of Antigonus's descendants. During the First War of the Successors, Craterus went directly after Eumenes' army, while Antigonus went after the south coast in cooperation with Assander and Menander, who seem to have been his subordinates. Antipater went to Cilicia and may have arrived after his colleagues had been engaged for months. Antigonus captured Ephesus and some Ionian Greek cities and then marched to Sardis in Lydia, where Eumenes was trying to make common cause with Cleopatra. Antigonus set 2,000 men in ambush in a pass that he thought Eumenes was likely to take, and the Greek general only evaded the one-eyed general because news of this ambush somehow reached Cleopatra, who relayed the information to Eumenes. Antigonus captured Sardis once Eumenes withdrew by a different route. All in all, although Antigonus had no historic moments during this war, he raised his stock greatly and put himself in good stead with Antipater, who was now the most influential man in the empire. At the Triparadisus conference in 321, Antigonus again played a crucial role. When Antipater arrived, he was taken off guard by a mutiny that Edea, the young queen of Philip III, was trying to spark among the veterans over pay. Antipater was surrounded by angry veterans, including the long-suffering Silvershields, and he was in serious danger of losing his life. Riding into the middle of these troops in full battle armor and cutting quite a figure, Antigonus delivered a long speech. Antigonus's loud voice and charisma drew everyone's attention, and Antipater was able to escape, probably with additional help from Seleucus. With Antipater safe, Antigonus also withdrew at great risk to himself. Antigonus was rewarded for his services to Antipater by being made the general of Asia and regent of the joint kings. Antigonus was desirous of a field command, something that he had not enjoyed thus far, and Antipater was in his debt. This made him effectively second only to Antipater in both power and prestige. Antigonus's commission as general of Asia was to defeat Eumenes and the remaining Perdiccans. As was his way, Antipater deepened his ties to Antigonus by arranging for his daughter Phila, the widow of Perdiccas, to marry Antigonus's son Demetrius, who was now about 17. Antipater also surrounded Antigonus with satraps loyal to himself, and made his son Cassander the second in command of Antigonus's army. Due to Antipater's presence in the campaigns of 321 to 320, he was effectively in charge of operations with Antigonus as a subordinate, despite Antigonus's official status as general of Asia. Eumenes was able to evade their forces and inflict minor defeats. Antigonus and Cassander seemed to have butted heads for unknown reasons, and Cassander left the camp in a huff and reported to his father that Antigonus was full of ambition and a danger to the Triparadisus settlement. When Antipater summoned him to hear these charges, Antigonus was able to allay Antipater's fears and convince the old man that his desire was to uphold the order of Triparadisus. Antipater by this point was tired and sick, so he confirmed Antigonus as general of Asia, but deprived him of the regency. Relocating with the kings to Macedon, Antipater did Antigonus the favor of taking Cassander with him. Now freed from having to deal with Antipater, Antigonus was able to prosecute his campaign against Eumenes more vigorously. At Orchenii in Cappadocia, Antigonus finally caught up to Eumenes and forced a battle. Antigonus won the battle, and then set out in pursuit to destroy his opponent, but Eumenes was able to evade him and reclaim the field at Orchenii to ensure that his fallen received the proper burial. Rather than being angry, Antigonus actually admired Eumenes for his cleverness. Knowing that he was no match for Antigonus, Eumenes holed up in the small city of Nora over the winter of 319 and 318, while Antigonus laid siege and went off to further subdue Asia Minor. In 319, news arrived from Macedon that Antipater had died. Antigonus knew that with the grand old man of the empire out of the way, his time had arrived. The new regent Polyperchon was technically his senior by virtue of his new office, but he was not as famous or accomplished as Antigonus. When Cassander approached him about his intentions to challenge Polyperchon, Antigonus eagerly agreed to help him. Antigonus wanted the regent to either be himself or else someone insufficiently powerful and prestigious to revoke his commission as general of Asia. In the meantime, Antigonus conceived of a plan to recruit and employ Eumenes. Eumenes was a highly capable commander, and Antigonus seems to have been far more open to employing Greeks in high office than his peers, as evidenced by his use of Nearchus as a key advisor, and of Aristomenes of Miletus as a key general. If Eumenes would agree to swear an oath of loyalty, Antigonus would release him and then employ him. Eumenes agreed to these terms on conditions that Antigonus had not approved of and would not learn about until it was too late. Eumenes had indeed negotiated his release from Nora and sworn an oath to do so. Instead of pledging himself to Antigonus, though, Eumenes pledged himself to Olympias and the kings, which was a fairly open-ended oath, given that Olympias was an empress and the kings were incapable of ruling due to age and incapacity. When Polyperchon began to make preparations to secure his position, he correctly identified Antigonus as a grave threat, and so he made efforts to reach out to Eumenes, effectively ordering him to fight Antigonus and keep him out of Europe. When Antigonus discovered the nature of Eumenes' oath and figured out what the Greek general was planning to do, he was furious and immediately ordered his men to shut Eumenes back in at Nora. Eumenes took up Polyperchon's commission and left the vicinity of Nora before Antigonus's men could catch him. Antigonus would not easily surrender his dream of employing Eumenes, who was an old friend and would have made a fantastic ally. When Eumenes decided to withdraw to the east, Antigonus had the option to either give chase or to stay in the west and intervene in the struggle for the regency in Macedon. Perhaps predicting a stalemate in the west, which wouldn't produce a winner anytime soon, Antigonus decided to give chase to Eumenes. Eumenes and Antigonus entered into an east that was riven between Python and Seleucus on the one hand, and the eastern satraps such as Eucestus and Eudamus on the other. After extended negotiations, Eumenes sided with the eastern satraps while Seleucus and Python joined Antigonus's cause. Both armies increased in size significantly when the respective alliances formed up in 317. Antigonus wanted to force an early battle on Eumenes, knowing that his authority over his men was far firmer than that of Eumenes, who had always struggled to get Macedonian aristocrats to follow his orders. When he arrived at the river Caprotes in Persia, which Eumenes had just crossed, Antigonus was determined to get across the swiftly flowing river without delay. Despite seeing Eumenes' scouts on the opposite bank, Antigonus forged ahead and had sent a considerable number of men across on boats when Eumenes arrived with a swift column and struck the men who had just landed. Antigonus's men panicked and swamped the riverboats, leading to significant losses and the devastation of morale. Around this time, Seleucus seems to have left the allied army for other duties, leaving Antigonus with just Python as a major allied subordinate. Antigonus withdrew his army into Python's province of Media for the rest of the summer, and then resumed his campaign in the early fall. Antigonus and Eumenes encountered each other in the Persian wilderness at a place called Perdiccas. Each side took up a strong position along parallel ridges with a ravine and river separating the two armies. Since the defender would have a decided edge regardless of who attacked, both generals decided to stand firm and await the attack of the other. Due to the terrain and remote location, both sides found themselves running short on provisions. Antigonus's army was the larger force, so he was probably feeling pressured to head out for forage earlier in the vicinity of Gabiene. Before he could withdraw, however, some deserters from his camp visited Eumenes and told him about Antigonus's plan. Eumenes then sent some of his mercenaries as false deserters with news that he intended to launch a night attack on Antigonus's camp. Rather than stilling a march, Antigonus had his men stand alert all night under arms. Meanwhile, Eumenes used this opportunity to slip away toward Gabiene, perhaps getting the idea that this would be a good place to resupply from Antigonus. In the wee hours of the morning, Antigonus learned that he had been deceived, and he was furious. Determined not to let Eumenes get away so easily, Antigonus took his cavalry forward and left Python in charge of the infantry to follow up as best as he could. Around daybreak, Antigonus's mounted vanguard came into contact with Eumenes' force as it was leaving the hills for the plain. Antigonus maneuvered aggressively to make it seem that his whole force was up and ready to strike. Eumenes, fearing that any forward progress could leave him exposed to a downhill charge, stood pat and lined up for battle. Antigonus, from his vantage on higher ground, was able to match his army's deployment with that of the enemy, a rare privilege for any commander to have in ancient warfare. Eumenes placed the satrap of India, Eudamus, in command of his left with a force of light cavalry, a small group of lancers, and some elephants stationed on a hill where they would be able to hold out against a larger force. In the center, Eumenes had 5,000 mercenaries, 5,000 men trained as Macedonians, the 3,000 silver shields of Antigones, and 3,000 men that Eumenes called his Hypaspis, and who were therefore probably Macedonians. Command of Eumenes' center was probably divided between Successors and Antigones. On the right, under Eumenes' personal direction, was his heavy cavalry, with which he intended to deliver the decisive blow. Eumenes had 2,900 horsemen, including 900 heavily armed companions. Eudamus' contributions of elephants allowed Eumenes to screen his entire front with elephants. In total, Eumenes had 35,000 infantry, 6,300 cavalry, and 114 war elephants. Antigonus, in the tradition of Philip and Alexander, stationed himself on the right flank with the heavy cavalry, which included Thracians and 1,000 companions under the command of his son Demetrius, who was making his major combat debut. Beside the strike force on the right and going to his left, Antigonus then stationed his 8,000 Macedonian phalangites, the 8,000 men trained as Macedonians, 3,000 Anatolians, 9,000 mercenaries, and then Python with his light cavalry on the left, including horse archers, where he was instructed to hold out against Eumenes' main thrust. Antigonus' hope was that the fighting would reveal a gap that he could ride through in true Alexander fashion. Joseph Pietrkowski, in his account of this battle, pictures Antigonus as an overweight, one-eyed Alexander looking for another victory like Isis or Gaugamela. When battle finally commenced at Perdiccas, Eumenes' force did not show any of the gaps that Antigonus had hoped for, and the two forces stood firm. Antigonus had the higher ground, and he had been able to customize his deployment, yet he had not been able to give himself any decisive advantage. While Antigonus was weighing his options, he saw Python swing into action unexpectedly. Rather than hanging back to receive Eumenes' assault as he was ordered, Python decided to take the initiative and get something going. Initially, Python enjoyed some success against Eumenes due to his superior mobility and the ranged attacks of his mounted archers. Eumenes moved some of Eudamus' light cavalry around to his right to counter Python's speed. In the meantime, the two phalanxes clashed in the center. Antigonus sat pat, looking for an opening and probably fuming at Python and the commander of his center, who had ignored his battle plan and initiated battle. The silver shields under Eumenes, the men who had led the great mutiny at Perdiccas, were cutting a swath through the Antigonid infantry opposite them and threatened to break the center. On Antigonus' left, Eumenes had finally caught and pinned Python, whom he soon routed from the field. At that time, the silver shields finally routed the Antigonid center. While Antigonus' generals wanted to fall back and regroup on higher ground, Antigonus decided that the best way to salvage the situation was to strike Eudamus' wing to halt the momentum of Eumenes' pursuit. Shattering Eudamus' reduced wing guard, Antigonus fell back to higher ground, and Eumenes' center and left halted their pursuit. The combination of Antigonus keeping his cool and his holding of the higher ground had helped him to stave off disaster. After some maneuvering to reinitiate battle came to nothing due to the combination of nightfall and exhaustion, both sides fell back and made camp. Eumenes had won a clear victory, losing only 540 infantry, a handful of cavalry, and perhaps around 900 wounded, as opposed to the 54 horsemen, 4,000 wounded, and 3,700 fallen infantry on Antigonus' side. However, while it was Eumenes' right to occupy the field and have Antigonus acknowledge the results of the battle by requesting a truce to bury the dead, Eumenes' men refused to march back to the field and instead demanded that they get back to the comforts provided by their baggage train. Antigonus was therefore able to claim the field and force Eumenes to request his dead, thus technically making Antigonus the victor of Perdiccas. It was a victory so hollow that Pyrrhus, who was an infant in Epirus at this time, would have probably laughed at Antigonus's claim. What little evidence we have indicates that no one was fooled into counting this as a win for Antigonus. After the battle, the two sides settled down for winter camp, each encamped in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains and separated by an arid plain. At one point during the winter, Antigonus tried to steal a march on Eumenes and hit him while his forces were divided. However, despite the panic of Successors, Eumenes was able to restore order, locate Antigonus's army, and set up fake campfires to make it look like he was ready and waiting for Antigonus's arrival. Antigonus fell back and only later discovered that he had fallen victim to yet another ruse from Eumenes. When the two generals emerged from winter camp in the spring of 316 BCE, Antigonus found that his numerical advantage over Eumenes had been diminished by his previous defeats. For the first time, Antigonus may have realized that defeat at Eumenes' hands was within the realm of possibility. It is probable that Antigonus was aware of the growing discontent among Eumenes' generals, but this is harder to exploit than it might seem at first blush. The two forces met head-on in the arid plain at the Battle of Gabion, one of the decisive battles of the Successor era. The Battle of Gabion was a bit of a confusing mess due to the dust that got stirred up, and it demonstrated the importance of having competent subordinates with steady nerves. Antigones mocked and demoralized Antigonus's phalanx, promising certain death at the hands of the Silver Shields, and so Eumenes' infantry was able to carry the center once again. On the flanks, Antigonus held the edge in cavalry, so Successors was routed from the field and seems to have become confused once the dust got stirred up. Antigonus sent some of his cavalry around to Eumenes' camp while the battle was ongoing and seized the baggage. Eumenes himself fought valiantly, but he was not able to prevent the rout of his skirmishers and his elephants. At the end of this confusing and dusty day, the fighting had been indecisive, but had badly damaged the fighting capacity of both armies, crippling Eumenes' mobility while shattering Antigonus' infantry. When Teutomus approached Antigonus to arrange the return of the baggage, Antigonus said that he would only trade the baggage in exchange for Eumenes. The Silver Shields had sung the praises of Eumenes just before the battle had started, and they had been the best performers in all of his eastern battles. Yet, since their baggage included all of their worldly wealth, they decided that Antigonus's offer was quite fair. Approaching Eumenes on the pretext of encouraging him to resume hostilities and win the day, the Silver Shields instead tied and bound the Greek general and delivered him over. After Gabion, Antigonus held the fate of his defeated foes in his hands, and he had some very difficult decisions to make. Finally, in possession of the Silver Shields, whom he had a burning hatred against for their actions at Triparadisus and all of the numerous casualties that they had inflicted on him in the battles of the late war, Antigonus ordered the unit to be broken up and sent off to a distant satrapy where they would be sent off on suicide missions. As for the commander of the Silver Shields, Antigones, Antigonus seems to have held this man responsible for the conduct of these troops and the treachery that they had shown to Eumenes and others, so he decided to burn him alive in a pit, the single cruelest act of Antigonus's known life. He also decided to execute Eumenes, the satrap of India, whose contributions had given Eumenes an edge in war elephants. Still attached to his dream of recruiting Eumenes himself, Antigonus could not face his old friend in his cell. Although Demetrius and Nearchus tried to persuade the old one-eyed general of Asia to recruit Eumenes, all of his other generals and advisors urged the execution of Eumenes. Finally, with great reluctance, the stubborn one-eyed general executed Eumenes after a couple of weeks of uncharacteristic indecision. In the wake of Gabion, Antigonos the One Eyed was at the height of his power. At this point in his life, Antigonus was still vigorous, despite being closer to 70 than 60, and he either directly controlled or was allied with everyone in Macedonian Asia. And he also finally had an adult son and heir to share the burden of his empire. Demetrius had fought well at Perdiccas and Gabion, and in the future, Antigonus felt comfortable entrusting him with considerable responsibilities, despite his youth. In addition, Antigonus had a number of nephews who debuted at or around this time. Ptolemaeus had already been involved in some of the talks with Eumenes, and he would play a major role in the Third War of the Successors. Another nephew named Telesphorus would also provide solid service during that conflict. By 314 BCE, Antigonus was on the cusp of claiming Alexander's entire empire for himself and his family. Only Macedon under Cassander, Thrace under Lysimachus, and Egypt under Ptolemy stood outside of his grasp. When Antigonus evicted his old ally Seleucus from Babylonia, the other successors went from fearing his ambition to viewing him as an immediate existential threat. The year before, in 315, when he was at Tyre, Antigonus received Polyperchon's son and agreed to issue a proclamation condemning Cassander as a usurper, in exchange for Polyperchon dropping his title of regent and joining Antigonus's cause. When the four-man team of Seleucus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus declared war on Antigonus in 314, the Third War of the Successors began in earnest. Antigonus's first move before moving west to his command was to summon Pithon for a conference to discuss strategy. Pithon attended, suspecting nothing. Instead of consulting with him, Antigonus had him executed. With Pithon eliminated, there were no more big-name successors in the eastern provinces to raise a revolt against him, and he was free to act in the west. Antigonus left Demetrius in Syria with a sizable army, and orders to hold the line. Demetrius was young but talented, and Ptolemy, for all of his gifts, was but an average commander, so Antigonus felt that this was a solid enough defense. Antigonus himself would focus on removing his remaining rivals in Asia Minor, and then cross into Europe to claim Thrace, Macedon, Greece, and the Regency. This strategy would add to his power and greatly enhance his legitimacy to the point that it would probably force Ptolemy to yield. At the start of the war, therefore, Antigonus's primary target was Cassander, the man who had deprived him of the regency in the first place. From 314 to 313, Antigonus personally focused on fighting Cassander, who controlled some territory near the Asian side of the Hellespont. After capturing and imprisoning this general, Antigonus began to look for ways to invade Europe. This campaign was mostly a preamble to his larger plan to invade Europe, but by itself, the campaign against Cassander had the significance of capturing most of Cassander's modest naval capacity, and thus preventing an invasion of Asia from Europe. To prevent a massed enemy concentration on the European side of the Hellespont, Antigonus sent his general Aristometus and his nephews Telesphorus and Polymaeus to actively campaign in Greece alongside of Polyperchon, who was officially Antigonus's chief lieutenant in the Peloponnese, but held little actual authority. In Greece, Antigonus's generals were able to make considerable gains. The real task facing Antigonus was ferrying his army into Thrace in the teeth of resistance from the talented and determined Lysimachus, one of the toughest soldiers that Macedon had ever produced. Analyzing the state of Thrace, Antigonus decided that the best course of action was to bog Lysimachus down with fresh revolts, since his previous victories had not thoroughly resolved local tensions, and then to move in while chaos reigned. Antigonus funded a revolt by the Greek cities of Thrace, sent a relief army to aid the rebels, and coordinated his efforts with the local Thracian dynast, Seuthes III. Although this plan threw the kitchen sink at Lysimachus, the former bodyguard of Alexander proved his resilience and resourcefulness by defeating each of these three opponents that Antigonus arranged for him separately, on his own terms and in rapid succession. Thus Lysimachus had foiled Antigonus's elaborate and well-laid plan, providing the best surviving example of why he had a reputation for military genius. Despite this major setback, Antigonus was hardly beaten, and he was not the kind of man who felt easily deterred. as his generals continued to make gains at the expense of Cassander, including Ptolemaeus' capture of the majority of the island of Euboea. Antigonus knew that Cassander would fold easily if he could just enter into Macedon at the head of his army. By this juncture, Cassander was already urging his allies to agree to some kind of peace with Antigonus, and even privately approached the one-eyed leader with peace proposals, all of which Antigonus shot down, since Cassander was his primary target. Since neither side had much going on at sea, Antigonus thought that if he could win over the polis of Byzantium with its modest fleet, he could get them to ferry his army over and then deal with Lysimachus and Cassander on land. Lysimachus, however, anticipated this move and convinced the Byzantines to refuse their help to Antigonus. Of course, when compared to the earlier attempt on Thrace, his rejection in Byzantium was a rather minor annoyance for Antigonus. As he continued to look for entry points into Thrace, Antigonus received ill tidings from the east, which convinced him that he was needed there and that his invasion of Europe would have to wait for another time. Leaving the war in the west in the hands of his subordinates, who were ordered to keep pressing Cassander from the south, Antigonus departed to help Demetrius. In 312 BCE, Ptolemy I had invaded Syria and defeated Demetrius in a pitched battle at Gaza. Not only did this mean that Ptolemy was able to expand overland into Antigonus's holdings, but far worse, it had opened up a clear path for Seleucus to return to Babylonia, where he was very popular. Seleucus raised a revolt in Babylon and then won over the eastern satrapies as well. When Antigonus arrived in the east and threatened Ptolemy's gains, he was ready to talk, as were Cassander and Lysimachus, who were in no shape to make gains at the moment. The Third War of the Successors ended in 311, but arguably the hardest fight of Antigonus's entire career was yet to come. One man who was not party to the peace that ended the Third War of the Successors was Seleucus. From 311 to 309, Antigonus and Seleucus fought the Babylonian War, which was essentially Seleucus's War of Independence. Our sources provide us with very little detailed information about this pivotal conflict except for its outcome. In 309, Antigonus agreed to recognize Seleucus's suzerainty over Babylonia, Persia, and all of the areas to the east, while Antigonus retained Syria and Asia Minor. Seleucus and Antigonus made a sort of non-aggression pact, which allowed Seleucus to focus on his eastern frontier and freed up Antigonus to work on his other enemies. At this point, it was clear that Seleucus was a major threat, since he had been able to defeat the combined might of all of Antigonus's resources just by himself. However, Antigonus thought that it might be wise to take out his other enemies first, and then come back for Seleucus later. While Antigonus was busy fighting and losing the Babylonian War, his other enemies were making moves to further undermine his power elsewhere. In Greece, first Cassander and then Ptolemy won the allegiance of his wayward nephew Ptolemais. Cassander's decision in 309 to kill young Alexander IV gave Antigonus a powerful propaganda tool and a way to keep his enemies in Europe in disarray. Releasing Alexander's illegitimate son Heracles to the custody of his ally Polyperchon, Antigonus hoped that Polyperchon would overrun Macedon, so that he would have an incompetent opponent reigning in Macedon, who would then be a much easier target and a non-threat to his holdings in Asia. However, Polyperchon and Cassander joined forces, and then Ptolemy invaded Greece with his now dominant fleet. Now mostly excluded from the Greek mainland, Antigonus sent Demetrius with the main army to restore their fortunes in Greece. He himself seems to have remained behind in Asia Minor so he could keep a watch on Ptolemy and Seleucus. Antigonus's relatively passive personal role in the Third War of the Successors and his obvious failure during the Babylonian War hints that at this point in his life that his age and weight had finally slowed him down. Antigonus was no longer the man who had defended Phrygia from a Persian invasion, nor the man who had chased down Eumenes and prevailed after many setbacks and hardships. Going into the Fourth War of the Successors, which began in 308, Antigonus was going to be leaning much more heavily on Demetrius and his generals than he ever had before. It looks like Antigonus was trying to avoid field service since, as Plutarch tells us, Antigonus had grown too fat to mount a horse and he was beginning to lose his balance. Demetrius campaigned in Greece and helped to restore Antigonid garrisons. Taking his fleet to Rhodes to counter Ptolemaic naval power, Demetrius won a great victory when his siege led to the fall of the island naval power in 305 or 304. This victory was of sufficient magnitude that the father-son duo saw fit to declare themselves kings. Their enemies would soon follow their example, but it was Antigonus and his son who were the first to abandon any pretense of serving the fallen Argead dynasty. Demetrius went back to Greece with an army of perhaps 50,000 men, and he invaded Thessaly on his route to Cassander's Macedon. A skillful commander, Cassander was able to hold his own with 30,000 men, and he began to seek allies. Up to this point, the Fourth War of the Successors had seen the Antigonids square off against just Cassander and Ptolemy. In 302, Lysimachus invaded Asia Minor, his first foray outside of Thrace. Antigonus roused himself to action and marched out to meet him. The size of Lysimachus's force and the threat that it posed to his core territories was grave enough that Antigonus ordered Demetrius to withdraw from Thessaly and come to Asia Minor. Antigonus's teenage grandson, also named Antigonus, stayed behind in Athens to control the Antigonid forces in Greece. When Demetrius joined Antigonus, he brought along a 17-year-old Pyrrhus of Epirus, recently exiled from his kingdom and eager to make a name for himself. Lysimachus, being outnumbered, was reinforced by Cassander's generals Perdiccas and Prepolaus. The Antigonids had a commanding numerical advantage and seemed to have been within sight of cornering and bashing the allied army until Seleucus unexpectedly arrived on the scene with another large force, which evened the odds. At Ipsus, two massive armies squared off. Antigonus commanded a force consisting of 70,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 75 elephants. The allied force opposed to him, which was commanded by either Lysimachus or Seleucus, but probably Lysimachus for reasons that I'll discuss when I cover Lysimachus, had 64,000 infantry, 15,000 cavalry, and 400 war elephants. We don't have many details of the action, but we do know that Demetrius carried the enemy in front of him and pursued them too far off the battlefield. When he tried to return to strike at the allied rear, Seleucus deployed his elephants to prevent Demetrius from returning to help his father. Isolated, Antigonus was overwhelmed and he fell in the fighting, slain at around the age of 80. Demetrius escaped with about 9,000 troops and tried to recover his father's empire, but the Antigonid realm would never be the same. Antigonus's death removed the man who had been the driving force of events for nearly 2 decades and opened up the possibility of Lysimachus or Seleucus acquiring the entire empire. Years after the Battle of Ipsus, someone saw a Phrygian peasant tearfully digging at the battle site. When a witness asked this peasant what he was digging for, the peasant responded that he was digging for Antigonus. While Antigonus had been harsh and had brought war to every corner of the empire, he was less cruel and a better administrator than either his son Demetrius or his immediate successor in Asia Minor, Lysimachus. While I disagree with the assessment of some scholars who say that Antigonus was the last and only real hope that the Macedonian world had of being unified under a single banner, it is hard to avoid thinking that Antigonus's prospects for achieving a lasting empire going into the Third War of the Successors were better than anyone's odds at any other point in successor history. By the time of Ipsus, Antigonus's moment for total unification had long passed, since he was too old to handle opponents like Seleucus and Ptolemy, and Demetrius, for all of his gifts, was not smart enough to defeat them without his father's guidance. Had Antigonus been a bit younger, done a better job staying fit, or handled his diplomacy more skillfully, he may very well have established an Antigonid empire that may have been capable of holding its own against the Romans. Unfortunately for Antigonus's legacy, his son Demetrius lacked his strategic vision and nearly destroyed the entire Antigonid house. Antigonus's grandson Antigonus II Gonatas was eventually able to claim the throne of Macedon and keep Antigonid kings in power until the arrival of the Romans in 168 BCE. A giant in both the literal and figurative sense of the word, Antigonos the One Eyed deserves a more prominent place in general accounts of world history than he typically receives.